This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad, and welcome to a bucket of fish left on your doorstep. And this video, I'm going to talk about resin. Now, a lot of people probably already know that I use Nova3d resin standard version for pretty much 90% of the prints that I make. In fact, I use this stuff so much, I checked my Amazon the other day, and I'd bought over 75 bottles of it. Now, I realize this is a lot of resin, and I've printed and painted a lot of things. A lot of large things and a lot of small things. And I've tried a lot of different resins. I've tried many types of resins, some flexible, some not. The best mix I can tell you to use is something like Nova with a slight mix of a flexible resin in it. But this is not about how to mix your resin. This video is about this Nova Wax Like Resin, which was sent to me to be tested upon the channel. Now, I must admit that over the last few weeks, I've definitely been delving very deep into the Warhammers, and this is a game of little plastic models that technically doesn't require 3D printers. However, in my case, I use my printer to print things to practice on before I waste my time painting the plastic, which costs a goddamn fortune. And so, because of this little Warhammers kick, I decided that I couldn't do anything with the new resin unless it was something to do with the Warhammers. Now, I found this model on one of the 3D printing for Warhammers groups, which we don't talk about because these are the things that are heretical upon the game of the Warhammers. So we do not speak of these groups. However, I did find this artist who created these amazing Space Marines, and I will leave a link for his work in the description below. Make sure to check him out if you want to print one. This specific model in this video is a free file, so if you want to get it for yourself, it's as easy as finding it in the description below. So Nova had tasked me with testing out this wax-like resin. And in reality, when they mentioned the word wax-like, I thought, well, that's not really going to work for someone like me who prints models that I want to paint later on. Funnily enough, wax-like doesn't mean anything like wax-like. So I'm not really sure where the translation is, but it's not wax-like. It is just resin, essentially, that kind of looks almost like wax. Almost. But it's not wax-like at all. So of course, if you would like to try out this resin, make sure to watch the rest of the video and let me know if you like it. I printed a bunch of things with this resin. I printed a lot of smaller models. I tried to print something slightly bigger. I also printed some really minute miniatures, which I will show off in this video. And hopefully this will help for you to realize what this resin does and see if it's something that you may like. Now, one thing I must say about this resin is quite fragile. So printing really small parts, they can be quite weak and they do break off very easily. The one good thing about this resin is the suggested resolution is 0.05 millimeters, which means it's a little bit higher than the usual 0.03 millimeters that I would use on most of my prints. And what this translates to is faster prints. But this does not mean that this resin prints less crisper. In fact, I found that on small miniatures, the resolution looked amazing. I almost couldn't tell any difference between 0.03 and 0.05 when using this resin. Of course, I never printed in the lower resolution with this resin, as the suggestions on this lovely piece of paper that they give you with the resin suggest not to go anything lower than 0.05. So I used that as the suggestion and I went off with it. Now, I used my Anycubic M3 Plus to print with this resin, and the reason why I used this is because it's one of my main workhorses at the moment, and it is one that is left out and available to work on while I'm busy working on my new studio. There was a couple of suggestions on this piece of paper. Number one was the exposure time, and I found that this needed to be adjusted. I think that this may be based on the Nova printers themselves. I don't think this takes into account many other light arrays that may be out on the market. So take that in mind and use these settings with a little bit of a pinch of salt. One thing I scrapped was the lift height at 6 millimeters. I just left it where it was stock. I didn't change anything. The suggested bottom exposure time, the problem with it being 45 seconds was that it cracked the base when I tried to take them off, so the raft would just disintegrate, and this is not very fun for removing prints from the build plate. I ended up dropping that down to around 30 seconds. I think you could go a little bit lower, but it's holding really well, and my rafts aren't shattering when I take them off, so this is working out fine for me. Also, the suggested exposure time of 2.5 seconds, I found this to be a little bit too high. Even on my machines, I feel like the light array is probably a little bit stronger, so I ended up dropping this down to around between 1.8 and 2.1. This is the time that I use for my exposure. This will change according to what machine you use and probably even the temperatures in your room. One of the biggest things of this piece of paper suggests to warm the resin up, and it suggests to warm it between 70 and 80 degrees. Now I have a kettle that allows me to adjust the temperature on that kettle to go between 70 and 80 degrees. So I warmed my resin up at 80 degrees, and this is meant to make the resin a little bit more flowy and make it, I don't know, print better. I'm not really sure the science behind it, but apparently you need to warm it up. So I warmed up my resin. I then threw that resin into the printer, and as you can see, it goes in lovely and smoothly. I then did multiple exposure tests. Now, this is something that many people have different ways of doing. Some people prefer the cones of calibration. Some people prefer those little flat discs that go at the bottom of the machine. I don't like any of them. I like Chimera Labs exposure test. That is the one I use. I don't care really if you like other ones. I don't care if you think this isn't the right one. It works well for me. It gives me all the information that I need to know how to tune in my resin. Now I printed 4 of these. I started at the suggested 2.5 seconds exposure time. This for me, it exposed the smallest of the little pillars, meaning this resin was just slightly overexposed. However, the details are pretty great. The gaps at the back with the measurements are a little bit too closed for me, so this meant I was definitely overexposed. So I went from here down to 2.3 seconds, and this one again showed me pretty much exactly the same as the 2.5 seconds. The next step for me was to go down to 2 seconds, and at 2 seconds I started to see things that I wanted to see. I also changed the raft at that time, the bottom exposures down to about 30 seconds, and this is when I got a little bit more flex in those rafts, which is definitely more helpful for getting them off the build plate. The other thing I noticed was that I was starting to see the measurements on the back of the town a little bit clearer. This meant I was getting much closer to the exposure time that was right for my machine with this resin. At 1.8 seconds, I noticed that all of the details were really extremely crisp, including this measurements on the back of the buildings. They were really great, and I found that around 1.8 1.9 was my general exposure time. This means also that you're shaving off milliseconds off each layer, so the more layers you have, the more milliseconds you'll be shaving off of that time. Now that I have the exposure correct for the resin, it's time to start actually playing with this resin and seeing what it can actually produce. The first thing that I printed was this really cool fat boy from Collect Fat. Now, of course, I can't say that word in my video because the videos are slightly family friendly. However, I do really encourage you to go check out this guy's work. I really like these little dudes. They are super cool, and I will definitely be collecting all of the fat. And one thing I did do is I used his pre-supported model. This is something that most people are going to do. They're going to get a model or an STL file, and they're going to print the pre-supported stuff. Most people do this. Now, this is not necessarily a reflection on resin. It's more a reflection on the person who has supported that model. And this is nothing really bad against people because every printer is going to print differently. The results I get out my machine may be different from the results you get from the exact same machine. The environment can change things, the resin can change things. Heck, even bottles of resin that have the same name, the same date, can be slightly different. There is different batch numbers. There is so much that can change. Essentially, this is a chemical reaction that is happening, and chemicals are volatile. They never react exactly the same, especially when you're talking about people mixing these things in factories, in countries. We don't know what's going on. At the end of the day, not all resins are going to be exactly the same, and not all printers are going to be exactly the same either. So I wanted to test how well this resin would stand up to somebody's pre-supports. This is exactly what a beginner or someone who doesn't know anything about this would do. Maybe they wouldn't do as extensive of an exposure testing like I did, but what they would do is buy the resin, buy the printer, get some files, stick the pre-support in, and click print and hope for the best. And I must say, this resin delivered. So I managed to get the print out. The print looks amazing, it looks great. The only thing is slightly not cool is the amount of layer lines that I can kind of see. As a painter, this kind of affects me. I could sand this off, and I probably should have sanded it off the gun at least, but I didn't find it was important to sand that off. At least not for this video. I wanted to show exactly how this resin came out and what kind of details it held. I want to see how this resin accepts paint. On the little dwarves, I didn't put any base coat down. I put no primer. I just painted directly onto the resin. And actually, I have no problems with that. For the Space Marine though, I painted him with a base coat. I used spray paint because I find this sticks really well to resin and it doesn't scrape off very easily, especially if you leave it to dry and cure really well, at least overnight. So I painted this Marine in my ultramarine colors, only because I had ultramarine decals which I could stick on his shoulders that were the right size to fit this model. But I have decided when he does release the rest of them, I'm probably going to paint a bunch of different factions. So if you would like to see that, make sure to leave a comment letting me know you would like to see more of this dude's models being painted in different faction colors in the thing where the words are that you need to leave for inside of the little square box. Now, of course, there is not much else I can say about resins, specifically this Wax Like Resin from Nova3d. However, it is a great resin. It works really well. The only downside for me is that it is a bit fragile. I have not been able to test whether I can mix flexible stuff with it yet. I did find the details to be more than adequate enough, especially on miniatures. I found them to be super crispy, and it really did stick well to supports, which is a good thing. Now, I can't say I'm an expert on anything that I do, and every video you watch, I have no idea how I'm gonna create the thing that I'm creating. This is something I figure out as I go along, and I like to share the findings that I make with you so that you are able to do the same kind of troubleshooting in your own printings and paintings later on down the line. Perhaps you found these videos and you're a beginner. These things might help you. Maybe you've been doing this for many years and you already know exactly what you're doing. But for some reason, this schmuck managed to figure out something you didn't figure out. And this is the reason why I make these videos. Hopefully you manage to find something in this video that will help you print and paint much better in the future. But I like making videos, you like watching videos, and if you don't like anything you saw in this video, the best thing I can say to you, bro, just click the dislike button and then take your computer, put it in your back pocket and jump out the window and f*** off. This video might be one of the difficult-to-list ones for me to edit. Maybe not. Let's hope it's easy.